Great, thank you. So we'll do a real quick intro. Skip Sauls, I work on the product team. I was on CRMA, formerly Tableau CRM, formerly Einstein Analytics, formerly Wave. And I'm now on a new thing which is called Salesforce Data Pipelines, Data Platform. We're kind of forming a new data-centric cloud, if you will, so data and identity. You'll hear some things today that kind of point in the direction where things are going. And I also want to talk a bit about a little bit of history. Now, I know you guys are English, you have a lot more history than Americans. I'm not talking about that kind of history. This is history that I have with a lot of you guys. And I want to show you a little tweet here from 2015. And this is the SFDC London user group, also called a DUG at the time. This is kind of before there were the communities, before there was anything called Trailblazer, Trailhead, et cetera. And a guy named Doug Chasman and I came over here on a tour launching a lot of what we called lightning components at the time. And this is actually the Aura components, not the LWCs you know and love today. And Doug was a architect and also a distinguished engineer at Salesforce. He's the father of Visualforce, the stepfather of Aura/lightning components. Really smart guy. And he and I came over here and spent about a week touring around the UK and also to parts of Europe. And if any of you are here, you might remember I couldn't speak because the day we arrived, I was hoarse. And this is way before COVID, nothing related to that. But it's one of those freak things where my voice was just gone. And so poor Doug is not a PM or outbound type person, but he loves to talk. But he doesn't like big groups. And we would go to different user groups. We went to different customers and that kind of thing. But he was kind of left hanging out to dry because I could not talk. I'm normally the real talkative one. Anyway, we had a lot of fun with that. And then a year and a half later, I was here talking about Wave. And notice it says, how you be able to package Wave apps using existing Salesforce tools. And so that actually ties into what we're talking about today. I'm going to talk about some of these things with the templates that we'll talk about. And I just want to point out that, we've been coming over trying to support the groups as long as possible. My last trip over was in September 2019, and I had 2 trips planned in early 2020, both of which got canceled. One because I had an injury to my shoulder, and the second one because the pandemic hit and suddenly, everything shut down. So these are, 6 and 7 years ago. It feels like a lot longer because of the pandemic. That was a long time, as some of you know. So anyway, I'm glad to be back. I have a lot of ties to England, to London. I lived here 22 years ago and worked here, and I've got 4 English godchildren. So I love coming back over here and spending time. And, you probably heard Todd kind of joking about, talking about Salesforce and stuff. And, a lot of you have a perception of Salesforce as being this big marketing machine. Some of us are actually geeks, and we love to talk about tech. And the marketing part is great. That's why Salesforce is successful, but we're not that side of Salesforce. And again, I'm not knocking it, but I'm a geek at heart and love to get up here and talk about stuff and probably get off in the weeds. So if we get off in the weeds too much, just drag us back up here. But again, that's my passion, is that side of the world. We always have to put these up. You've seen these a million times, but I might talk about a few things today that are not in the current release. Don't make any decisions, yada, yada, yada. You know the drill. I'm a PM, so I am pretty well versed in saying forward-looking statements, or this is for the future, this is something we're thinking about, but just keep that in mind when you hear something exciting. So what is this thing called the Salesforce Data Platform? Well, it's actually a lot of existing tech. It's not a net new thing. It's not from an acquisition. It's not something we just invented, outright. It's really the realization that we need to take some of the existing technologies and form a more proper platform for dealing with data. And one of the things we're looking at is how do we keep people on Salesforce and bring them into Salesforce? And one of the things that some of you know is that there are times when you have to go to a public cloud, be it Amazon or Google, Microsoft, et cetera, because it's too expensive or too hard to do it on Salesforce. And that's a really distressing thing when you're a Salesforce employee who's proud of the Salesforce platform. You're like, why would they go to Amazon for this? Well, it costs too much to do it in classic Salesforce. It costs too much to do it in CRMA. So we're trying to address some of these. You'll see some of the baby steps towards that, but that's kind of the plan, is to make it so that if you want to stay in Salesforce, You have the platform to do it and the tools to do it and the support to do it. Whether you're a dev or an admin or a data analyst, you'll feel like, hey, I can actually use Salesforce for everything. Now, that's not to say it's exclusively everything. We're going to have great ways to connect to external data and work with external. So we're not saying you have to use Salesforce. We want you to feel comfortable with it and not feel like you have to go elsewhere. You've probably seen slides like this over the years. I'm really just going to set up a couple of things. I'm not going to talk to every slide. I just want to show you, all the different things that make up this thing we call Salesforce now. It's actually very large. And some of these, come out of the classic cloud. They're built on the Salesforce platform, which is, based on Java and a SQL-based server. Some of them come from things like CRMA, which don't have their roots in traditional Salesforce platform, but they are part of the larger Salesforce platform. They have traditional metadata. They have the Connect APIs. They have all the security. So when you're using CRMA, you're using a Salesforce entity, a Salesforce property. It's in the data center. It's not an Amazon service running somewhere and that kind of thing. And there's other pieces that are integrated at different levels, but our goal is to get them all integrated with a single security model, metadata model, and that kind of thing. And it takes time. As you know, some of these have very large platforms. But we're excited to see a lot of these being brought into the fold, so to speak. And I'm a Salesforce person through and through, and if it was up to me, every cloud, every acquisition would have 1 to 3 releases to get in the platform and make it available. That's just kind of my take. I'm not in charge, so it takes a little longer at times, but that's, again, our goal. And this is a build slide, just kind of showing stuff, but I'm not going to dig into this. But we want to point out these users here, customers, ISVs, and devs. We have a lot of people who support our customers. That's a great thing. My world is largely around devs and our ISV partners, and that's my passion. I do a lot of things around packaging and how do you get things out to the customers. Who here is a Salesforce partner, ISV, SI, OEM? So, I have either worked with some of you guys, know you guys. That's really my world. And that has a big crossover, obviously, with devs. So a lot of the things I'm passionate about for tooling, debugging, management, monitoring, all the lifecycle type stuff fits in really well in both of those, whether you're a Salesforce dev doing things for a customer or you're a partner doing it. So what is this data platform? Well, you've seen a lot of things about CRMA, and this is actually the data portion of that. So think of things like the ELT. How do you bring data in? Think of the query engine. Think of how do you scale things and how do you connect to things? It's all the various data-centric pieces of CRMA, but it's now a separate entity. It has its own licensing. Even has its own runtime in places, but it's the same code base. It's not like we went off and invented a new thing. And if you know CRMA and you understand that, the data platform is a very easy transition. The difference is it does not have the analytics pieces. It doesn't have the visibility, the visualizations. It doesn't have lenses and dashboards and that kind of thing. You still go to analytics when you need to do that kind of thing. And it's really data centric. It's not meant for pure analytics, but it's meant for you to say, how do I get the data into Salesforce? How do I bring it in? How do I connect to things? And it has a real strong focus on how do I write things back into Salesforce directly. So you've heard us talk about data sets and that sort of thing. Those are all still there, but a lot of things are meant for you to use something and write it back directly into Salesforce. And that has its own set of interesting things that happen there. Obviously, since it's going back into the Salesforce platform, you have to be careful you don't just overwhelm your system with things. Analytics, the query engine, and that sort of thing is a very powerful, high-scale type thing. If you're going to pump all that back into Salesforce, you're going to run into your limits very quickly. So we haven't necessarily changed that, but we've made it much easier. And as you saw in the demos a few minutes ago, making it much easier for you to show these things live. So data pipelines, it's the concept of several different recipes working together with connectors, bringing things in, processing it. It's really kind of a naming, kind of a branding for all these things that are in this data piece. And I'll show you little bits of this here in a second. And one of the things we want to point out is that we use this to power lots of things inside of Salesforce. And this is important because over the past 6, 7, 8 years, we've had a lot of other clouds say to us, hey, we want to use the technology you have in this thing, which we now call CRMA, CRM Analytics. And they said, how can we leverage that? How can we get to that kind of scale? How can we get to that kind of access? How can we do all these cool transforms you do? And some of the clouds also realized, hey, we can actually use this and not have to go invent all of the cool things you guys have done. You've solved all the things around security, identity, packaging, and that sort of thing. So they're leveraging us for things that we've already dealt with. Now, as a product team, and you guys know this yourself, when you have more and more people asking for things, it can be kind of daunting. And, when you tell the devs suddenly there's a lot more new people asking for stuff, it kind of makes them nervous. But for people like myself, it's really awesome because it validates all the work we've done. It's like, hey, this is proving out that this actually is a really good, cool technology, whether or not it's powering analytics or powering something else. So you're going to see this, appearing in various places. And I say appearing, you probably won't even know it's there a lot of times, but underneath a lot of these platforms and products will be this data platform. This just shows kind of a stack view, all the different pieces. And again, you're familiar with most of the things inside here. There's nothing really net new here, but over time we'll add more and more capabilities and make it easier to use. You've probably heard things like Salesforce Easy, make things low code, no code. We have those kind of mandates to make all of these things as easy to use as possible, as approachable as possible. And then the flip side of that is make it so that people are using it, but they don't know they're using it. You don't want a bunch of end users worrying about whether a recipe is being used to pull something in and transform it. That makes no sense. That's like telling end users, hey, there's Apex over here, and check out this Visualforce page. It's not their world. So we want to make it so that they can use a lot of these things, and they're benefiting from it, but they don't use it directly. And we do this with analytics. We embed dashboards, we embed KPIs, queries, and all kinds of cool stuff now. And the end user is not really even aware of what happened underneath the covers. To them, it's another Salesforce Lightning page. It looks like a report. It looks like some number on the page. But behind the scenes, how it got there might be very different than just a traditional query or Apex or something like that. One of the things also that will be included is these transforms. And we're trying to include these functions so that you can do things more easily with your data. And a lot of the focus is on things people do very commonly. And we'll add more and more of these over time. Some of these are derived obviously from the analytics world. And the goal is that you can bring in data from almost anywhere, and someone who's not a hardcore data scientist can use these to kind of wire things together, transform this with some functions, and get the data in the form that they want. And then the query engine itself, we keep working on scaling this thing up. And I tell people there's kind of two sides of this. There's one which is we want to make sure that when you go to access your data, when you run these queries, when you show these dashboards, that it's as fast as possible. That's the speed side of things. You run a query and it's almost instantaneous. So we want that to be there. And analytics has had this history of being able to do some cool transforms and that sort of thing. And behind the scenes, all these queries and bindings and that kind of stuff are making all that possible. And they're backed by this query engine that's faster than things you could do with a traditional SQL-based database. It scales higher. You can deal with hundreds of millions and even billions of rows of data in near real time. But the flip side of that is scalability for us, and this is because Salesforce has shared resources in the data center. We're not a cloud in the same form that you might think of like Amazon and Google and that kind of thing. There's not a virtual machine being spun up for every single org. And the orgs have this shared space, shared resources and that kind of thing. And we need to make sure that we can scale this and, as we say, not burn up the servers. And it makes the executives upset when they find out that a customer over here can't get to something because some customer over here is eating up all of the CPU cycles and all of the IO networking and that kind of thing. So we do a lot of work behind the scenes to make this happen. And this is true for all of Salesforce platform, not just CRMA, not just this whole data world, but it's something that you may not think about when you use Salesforce itself. And again, a lot of people come from public clouds and they assume that there's a dedicated VM per org, and it's not like that. It's a different kind of model. So we want to make sure we can, distribute the queries and do all these cool things behind the scenes to scale it, and that you don't have to think about that. Because if you ever had to do parallel programming and distributed queries and distribute operations, that's tough. That's a real hardcore computer science type thing. We're doing that work so you don't have to. And that's why you invest in something like Salesforce. That's what the platform provides. So again, telling you kind of why we do some of these things, why we're doing it. It's not just about showing you 10 billion rows. That's a cool thing, but it's also making sure we can support that. Connectivity, as I mentioned, we want you to use Salesforce as much as possible. We want to make sure that you can bring things into Salesforce and also take things out of Salesforce. You know, we hope you're not just exporting a bunch of things out and leaving Salesforce. We want you to stay on the platform, obviously, it's part of our business. We want to make sure you can get to all the different types of things. And we have our traditional connectors that come from the CRMA world. If you've been here for a while, you know we've had different partner connectors. We've got our own connectors. And we're now going to expand this even further with connectors coming from the customer data platform from CDP. So in the future, you'll have multitudes of ways to bring data in and push data back out. And we're working on it so that this is better than traditional data import and bulk data loaders and that kind of thing. So we want to make sure that you can use this and bring the data in, do something with it, maybe make it available to somebody, and then if you need to export it, you have those tools as well. So it's not as difficult to work with external systems. The data manager is something that you have probably seen if you've played around with CRMA anytime in the past few years. What's interesting is there's the traditional data manager, which we had inside of Studio. It was actually a version of Studio, and it ran inside it. Data Manager now is a full Lightning-based app, Lightning Web Component-based, and it can run independently of Studio. And this is important for things like the data pipelines because they don't have access to Studio. If you use data pipelines, you're not using CRMA. It's a different license, different set of things that you can have access to. So it's important that we get this over into a pure Lightning-based app that's standalone. But the experience is largely the same. You're dealing with the resources there. You've got new and better ways to edit your recipes. You've got new and better ways to do the monitoring and management and that kind of thing. And we'll keep improving this. But this is largely a data-centric person's view of the world. And this can be developers, can be admins, data scientists, and that kind of thing. Maybe not necessarily the person doing the hardcore analytics, but somebody who understands data and advanced admins and that kind of thing. But to be perfectly frank, there's a lot of people you don't necessarily want to throw into this world. This requires some training, trailheads, classes. If you're a partner, you've probably got to do some hand-holding or do the work for them. And we want to make sure that that's not the case for every time you want to use data inside of Salesforce. This is part of Salesforce Easy and part of the admin experience, which can be very different from the more detailed experience here. So I'll show you some of those tools here in a second, kind of where we're going with that. So let me just show you a couple of things here. I'm going to try to juggle my podium here. Oops, that was not what I wanted. Let's see here. So this is the data manager, and this is actually the summer release here. So if you have early release access, you can get to this. This is not an internal preview or anything like that. But this is something you can take and play with. If you're interested in it, ask your sales rep, SE, PAM, TE, etc. And there's actually org you can get to spin this up and play with it. It's meant for you to try things out, and you get to it. Either from CRMA or separately from CRMA. It's going to be launched from it, or it can be accessed from like a setup page. Recipes, if you haven't seen some of these, I'll show you one that comes from a demo. And I'm not going to go through and do a lot of hardcore recipe editing here, but I want to show you that this is a flow-based editor. Yes, fix it. That's actually my bug. And it's got the nodes here for bringing something in, and you'll see the preview down here at the bottom. It's got the transforms, and we mentioned the functions here. So there's a detect sentiment, and let me boost the font a bit. Maybe that'll be easier to read. And so this is a little sample we're doing for some of what we call data templates, and it has a detect sentiment formula. And it has a formula here for running some SQL to actually assign values to it. And then it's going to output things. And it can output to a data set, it can output directly to Salesforce, lots of options around that. This is something that could take, we could do demos for this for days. but I'm going to show you how we make this easier to approach and work with here in a second. Go back here, and let me go ahead and run one of these. We're going to talk about data templates here in a second, but let me go ahead and show you kind of what these things are. So first off, who here is familiar with CRMA templates, or analytics templates, as we like to call them? So a few hands here and there. Who here is familiar with packaging on the Salesforce platform? Okay, just a short primer for those of you who don't know, packaging is our standard way of distributing assets to other orgs. And think of a package as being analogous to a zip file that contains lots of different resources based upon everything in your org that you want to share with someone else. And this can be, it can be metadata. In fact, it's almost always metadata, but it can be Apex classes, it can be schemas, it can be all sorts of things. Almost anything you can express in metadata, you can put into these packages. There's a manager for it. The UI is kind of dated looking, but it works really well. And then when it's all done, you give somebody a link, and when they click it, that gets installed into their org. There's a lot of details in between, but that's the general idea. So again, it's analogous to you zipping up something and sharing it with somebody. Now, where it gets interesting is that there's a lot of resources that are runtime focused inside of Salesforce. So if you think of an Apex class, we're going to execute that class by calling some function typically. We're going to call something, pass in some parameters, get something back. And we do some processing inside it, typical programmatic type things. If you look at things like a Visualforce page or a Lightning Web Component or Aura components, those are rendered when you access it from a browser. So someone makes an HTTP request, and behind the scenes, we're going to serve up something where we do some maybe server-side processing, and then a lot of times some client-side processing, browser-side processing in this case. So they're all very dynamic in that sense. When you deal with things like layouts and schemas and that sort of thing, those things are interpreted and run dynamically by the server. Now, analytics gets interesting because when you work with analytics, you're typically doing things like creating data sets. And a data set is not an exact copy of what's in the Salesforce org. It can be, but if you're doing just direct copies, you're really kind of using it as a glorified cache. That's really the extent of it. Typically with analytics, you're trying to get the data into a form that makes it possible for you to do the queries, do the bindings and so forth, and make it very powerful. Because you're really using data to say, how do I reveal something or make something available to my users that's maybe not obvious from the raw data that's in records and so forth. And again, people have used this as again, I say a glorified cache, but most people get into analytics and they're doing something cool with it, And my passion for data is tell me something with analytics that I didn't know before, that I can't see. I'm not what they call a quant. I'm not a savant who can look at things and figure stuff out. But I know computers are really good at this. And when they show some trend or some KPI, I get that aha moment. It's like, holy cow, that's something that I would not have known had I not been able to use this app. And for end users, it's something that bubbles up and shows up in Lightning or a dashboard or a report and that kind of thing. And again, a lot of you who are the DataTribe know this. The devs most likely know this. And CRMA is actually really awesome at this. This is why we pitch it. And these templates are important because you can't just take a data set and move it from one org to the other. You can, but it usually doesn't make any sense. And that's because the data set has a lot of ties to the customer's org data. So the org shape, the data itself, it's all very different from org to org. And it gets very interesting because our customers love to customize Salesforce. They love to have, custom schemas. They have custom objects, they have custom fields. And if you talk to multiple customers, you'll realize, hey, they almost never have the exact same shape for their org. They've got, different things here. And they say, well, we actually use this field to represent this value, So if you try to do that manually, and you take an analytics data set, for example, and you say, I'm going to move that over. And I say a data set, you're actually moving over a recipe or a data flow that generates a data set. If you do it manually, it probably doesn't make any sense on that destination org because the fields are different, the names are different, everything is very different about it. And a lot of what you've built just doesn't carry across. Even if you have the exact same, even if you copy the org in some way, it's still probably not going to work because IDs are different. So what a template does is it says, let's take that original asset, which is the recipe, data flow, dashboard, lens, et cetera, all these things that you've heard people talking about today. And we're going to convert that into a intermediate transportable or portable form, I should say. And what we do is we actually take the original asset and we run it through a processor, basically a transform engine, and we strip out things like IDs and names and hard-coded references and so forth. And we turn it into an intermediate form, which is it's JSON, and we store that as the metadata. We put that into the package. And when you install that package remotely onto a different org, we then reverse that process and we turn it into something that will work on the destination org. And we can do this in a very simple fashion, which says just make it work, or we can do it in a very sophisticated fashion, which says ask the user something about their org shape, and then generate those assets based upon their responses, or do it programmatically through Apex, for example. You can say, okay, look at that org and say, figure out programmatically what it needs to be. And then we reconstitute those data sets on the remote org in the correct form. And we can do this without you having to manually go in and tweak and tune every data flow recipe, et cetera. That's painful. You know, if you have to go in every single customer and, you know, copy things over and manipulate stuff, it's tough, you know, and some people like to do that. After a while, it gets very frustrating, especially when you have lots of them. So templates help solve that. There's huge amounts of tutorials on templates and that kind of thing, but it's really aimed at getting things from one org to the other. So what are these data templates? How's that different? Well, the data template is the same exact technology, but scoped to these data pipelines. So it only does the recipes and data sets and so forth. It doesn't do lenses and dashboards. So it's kind of a subset of the CRMA version. I'm going to create a new data app here. And as a quick aside, if you've ever used things like sales analytics or service analytics, those are actually analytics apps. So they're based on this template engine we're talking about. When we run those and distribute those across all of the different Salesforce orgs, that's what's happening behind the scenes. We're creating those things dynamically using this engine. So with the data app, I've got a little wizard here, and I can pick different templates. And each of these templates are something that is, first off, you know, we generate it for you, the raw version. And then typically the developer takes it, takes the metadata and edits this thing in Visual Studio Code to make it more powerful. And I'll show you that process here in a second, but let's go ahead and kick off one of these. And I'm going to say next. And with a template, you have several different ways to manipulate the values. And one of them is basically a JSON path injection mechanism where you say, at this path, change this value based upon a variable or expression or a macro. These things we call rules. So a variable, as its name implies, is the thing you want to change. And you can give the variables a type, most of which map to standard Salesforce types. So in this case, I've got my source object name. Well, that's an S object type. And it will show you all the S objects in that org that you can select from. And you can have us generate the list. You can generate your own filtered list if you'd like to. And then the user picks an object like account, for example. And then the second one down here is the S object field type. And this actually is tied to the one above it, kind of like a binding. And it says populate that with only things that are relevant to the account here. So this was populated for me. I didn't have to write all this code. There's no Apex or anything behind the scenes, no query. And then I pick something like, what's another one that'll fit into this? I think we need strings. So we'll do account name here. So I'm adding a couple of fields here to do sentiment analysis on. And then you can make things conditional. Like if I were to right now go to the next screen, it's going to say, let's go create this thing. But let's go back. And I've got a conditional here, a Boolean. And if I've set that Boolean, it knows now to go to a different screen here and lets me pick additional fields to add to the data set. Because sometimes you want to have additional data that's not in the sentiment analysis. Now, this may seem really geeky, but this is important because we don't want you to have to go and programmatically build your own wizards and that kind of thing every time. We want to make sure it's a consistent experience, and you're just doing things by telling us what you want to display. In this case, it's also fields from the account, and I'll add in like type, and I don't know, maybe let's find one that has some data, account source. And this is a contrived example. It's meant to kind of show you things, and we're doing this to teach people how to use this platform. So I do next, I give it a name, and I'll call this the user group. Hopefully I typed that right. And click create. And if you've been using CRMA for the past few years, you've seen a wizard like this for creating apps. That's actually tied to Analytics Studio. It's actually built, we actually used React for a lot of that UI, and it's tied to that. This is a pure LWC-based component. And what we're working on is making that so you can launch that from anywhere, from setup, from your own apps and that kind of thing. It'll be a release or two before we get to that point, but that's kind of the vision, is make this possible everywhere and make it so that an admin can use this without being a data manager user, for example. We don't see everybody as having to go to data managers to do these kind of things. All right, now this thing actually kicked off some things that go actually create these assets and start running them. And you can see here in the status here, it's running. And I want to show you something else that you may not be aware of, but there's a setup page for these things called auto-installed apps. And again, I've kind of got it zoomed in to show you the text. And this shows the requests. And let me go through and refresh this page. And this is showing the app creation progress. And this is important because behind the scenes, we're going off and we're creating all these assets, then we're going to run the recipe. So there's two kind of phases to this. And there can be a lot of things being created here. There can be, in this case, it's going to be the recipes, and it's going to schedule and run them. If it's a CRMA app, it also has dashboards and lenses and extended metadata, all kinds of cool stuff behind there. And the template framework takes care of putting those in the right form and making everything work correctly. And again, it may not seem all that magical until you try to do it yourself manually. Then you realize, hey, this thing actually has done some pretty cool stuff. I'm not trying to brag. I'm just saying there's a real problem we're solving there. And let me show you this here. This should refresh here, hopefully pretty quickly. So that says success. And I'm going to go here now and look at the logs, and we're working hard to provide more detailed information. And I'm going to show you some even more interesting, cool stuff here in a second. This is important because, like many of you, I get really frustrated when something says, please contact your Salesforce support person, and it gives you a number. And you're like, it's like, why? So I come from the platform world, the developer world. We're going to make sure we can expose as much to the people who need it, i.e. the admin, the developers, and that kind of thing, so they can take action on it, because it's kind of silly to have to create a ticket to do something that an admin can go fix themselves. It's like, hey, you're missing a field here. You're missing this. You need to add permissions and that kind of stuff. So that's our vision, is to make it really easy. But also, conversely, we don't want to scare off all the average users. This is not going to pop up inside of their Lightning page or their dashboard stuff. This is really aimed at admins and developers, or I hate the word, but admin developers is a word I've heard used a little bit. So people who cross over, what we used to call the hero admins, the people who are admins, but they're also doing a little bit of VF, a little bit of Apex, and that kind of thing. So we're trying to appeal to that, the low code, no code. I heard a phrase yesterday called pro code. I'm like, I don't even know what pro code is, but it sounds cool. So. Anyway, that's our promise to you, is to try to make all this easier and more visible. And then back in here, we should be able to click here. So this, let's find the last modified. Does it sort? Well, let's go here. Oh, there's user group there. So there's the thing it's creating, the recipe. And I'm going to open this recipe up. And I want to show you what the recipe looks like when it's generated. This is, in fact, similar to the one we just opened up. But this is actually generated from those inputs. It's dynamically generated. And what we're doing is actually generating the JSON inside of the recipe. And the recipe has a JSON definition. I'm going to show you this in VS Code in just a second. But it's actually generated from that based upon those selections you made. And that's pretty cool if you think about it, because you're not doing it programmatically. We're not asking you to write Apex or JavaScript something to generate this. We're doing it based upon these selections and these expressions and that kind of thing. To show you what that looks like in code, so this is the original thing. Let me zoom in a bit. And how do I close that thing? There we go. So this is a recipe that has been brought down inside of a template. So you see my name, data app, sentiment analysis. It's got a lot of things that are specific internally. If you start digging into it, here's my detect sentiment node, loads the data set, does all these things. And if you look at it, it's pretty logical. You can read it. We don't advise you to go write this thing manually, but you can take this and see this form of it. And what's interesting is, this was built by another developer, a guy that works on a team with us, and he handed it to me, and I took it and turned it into a template. And I first made the template, and then I made it into this dynamic thing. And I'll show you a bit about that. And this is going to look funny because you probably don't know the expression language and that kind of thing. Don't worry about that. It's pretty straightforward. We have things that are, expressions and rules and variables and that kind of thing. And to show you some of the moving pieces, let's see, we're going to find the one that's called the base. There we go. So we have a template info, and this is where you tell it, I want to make a data template. It means it will run on SDP. It doesn't require a CRMA. And you can put in things like, what do you want to have for titles and names and external files and images and stuff. So it's kind of the information about the template itself. And then we have variables. And like the name implies, the variables are the things you want to customize. And I mentioned JSON paths. So if you look at a JSON path, it's something dot something dot something, kind of like XPath, same basic concept. And you're saying at some point, modify the value based upon some selections from a list, whether it's an enum or it's a object type, etc. Very, very logical. When you play with it a bit, you're like, okay, that makes sense. So we talked about the Boolean that says, do I have additional fields? And that's the data set selects additional fields. I'm not super creative. I'm kind of verbose. I'm trying to teach stuff here. But this shows the default value. This is the expression language. It says where to grab this from, from the S objects. The source object fields here is of the type, S object field type. Again, most of these map to standard Salesforce types. And you can tell it, the max size I want, the min size, and that kind of thing. You have all kinds of ways to constrain it. And if you want, you can put a list of enums. You don't have to give everybody the full selection. And then once you have those, you have the template to app rules. There's an app to template process. Most people don't write rules to that. Most of them focus on this template to app piece. And just to kind of describe what this thing does, it says, go through and do these evals and puts and sets on the object. And I mentioned the place where it goes. So there's $.recipedefinition.node. So dollar's kind of the global. You guys know about that. So it's saying, on my template I'm working on, go to the recipe definition, to the nodes, and in this case, put something. So we're going to add things to it. So it's put, set, that kind of, all the standard verbs. And then it has these macros, which takes a little bit to get your head around, but it's basically a programming language that lets you call these macro type, these function-like things that are these macros, and those get expanded out into the JSON for the template, for the recipe, I should say. And these macros, a lot of times, like insert sentiment nodes, it has a parameter which is the index. Actions, it can do its own evals, it can call additional things, and ultimately it's going to return something. And let's see if we can find that in here. Oops, let's go a little further up. So here's one that's, okay, insert detect sentiment node, and it takes a source field and sources, and it returns this value here. So there's my actions, my parameters, my target sentiment score fields, and the sources is the sources that you've provided it. Here's multiple objects in a list, and it says for each one of those, generate this node here. And again, for those of you who are developers, this is not that hard to figure out. Most end users will never see this kind of thing. This is part of the thing we do to support it. But this lets you build these things and run them on almost every org out there. And if you run them, and let me show you one more quick thing. I know we're up on time. We've got a new, very exciting thing here. And I say exciting because it's something we've been working on making available. When these apps run, what happened to it? And I'm not going to show you the whole process, but now there's a new way to create these apps, and you have a debug level you can set, which maps to the ones you've probably seen in the debug console. So you have find, finder, finest, warning, etc. Same exact settings. And at the finest setting, you get back quite a bit of information. And let's go here. And at every step, we're going to go first and validate the organization. Is this thing correct? This is often written in Java internally or Apex externally. Check existing processes, check the dependent apps, create the application, create the data sets, create data set for case, for user. This is the sales app, so it's lots of different things. And it goes through in each one of these telling you, did it succeed? Did it fail? What's the additional info? So just lots of verbose information that you didn't get before. Before you would see a few lines, and we had a few platform events, but if it failed, you're left stuck thinking, oh my gosh, what do I do now? So we're trying to empower our end users, but more importantly, our partners. Like if a partner has a customer they're supporting, they don't have to contact Salesforce and figure it out. They have all this information at hand. We talked to somebody today that wants to make platform events out of these. We'll probably make that possible. So you can actually get notifications on this. Hey, my customer's app has failed. Notify me in some way. Maybe it kicks off a flow. Maybe it does something action-based. I know we're up on time. And my voice is actually going out from talking, but I love this stuff and want to talk to you guys more. We'll be back some point. I'm not sure when we'll be traveling again. Arthur is actually based in Europe, so he can make it over here pretty easily. Come over by train or something like that. So I'm encouraging him to get out because these things are awesome for us. We get great feedback from you guys. And reach out to us on the community. Reach out to your Salesforce reps. I'm on Twitter as Skip Sauls. We're on the community. I don't know if we have public Slack type stuff or not now. But anyway, we look forward to hearing from you. And let us know what you want out of this, out of the, both the data platform and from CRMA. I'm super excited by it. I think we've got lots of cool stuff coming. And if you're not hearing or seeing something, just ask. Let us know what it is you think we should be doing that better. How can we help you? And with that, I'll wrap it up from my side. And thank you again.